All right, guys, sorry about that. Apparently, my SD card ran out of battery and cut me off in mid-sentence. Or, I'm sorry, ran out of memory. So we were just talking about graded potentials, and we were talking about the processes of repolarization and hyperpolarization. So I'm going to go ahead and forward a slide. So a graded potential, remember, is any of the small changes that happen when we open a ligand-gated channel. And they're small, so it's just a few positive ions might drift in, and they affect the immediate area, but it really is not a strong enough signal to cause any real changes in the cell. The graded change, depending if I opened up a chloride channel, since chloride is a negative ion and it's crowded outside, it might actually drift into the cell and take us more negative, like from negative 70 down to negative 75, and that would be a hyperpolarization. Or we could open it up for sodiums, and sodiums would, of course, be a regular depolarization. The stronger the stimulus, the greater change in the membrane potential for a local or graded potential. So they're not great at being consistent. So, for example, if we looked at this, if we opened up a few chemically gated channels and we let a few positive charges in, if we don't make at least a negative 60 or negative 55 millivolt change, it'll just eventually go away. Okay, we can also do that with a negative one, and it will just be returned to resting membrane potential. So local or graded potentials don't really cause any long-term changes on their own. However, we do use them. They are useful. We can sometimes use them to tell a cell to exocytose something or something like that. Acetylcholine causes a graded potential at the motor end plate. So we just saw this in chapter 10 where we used acetylcholine to open the sodium channels, and enough sodium started to come in. And at the time we just said you got a new action potential. Well, I'm going to kind of fill it in a little bit more. We got enough sodiums to come in through the ligand gated channels to reach threshold. And then when we reach threshold, that's when the magic happens. So most local or graded potentials are caused by ligand gated channels. The big signals, the action potentials, are what happen when we cross threshold. And it has to do with that little voltmeter I showed you earlier, where we open activation gates for sodium when we hit negative 60 millivolts. Now, different texts will say different numbers, negative 60 or negative 55, something in there, okay, depending on the cell type. And once we change with the ligand-gated channels up into that particular amount of voltage change from negative 70 to negative 60, that will open all of the voltage-gated channels for sodium. Now, they open at negative 60 millivolts. Now, lots more sodium can come in. We get a huge depolarization of the membrane, and it goes all the way up until positive 30 millivolts. And then remember, at positive 30 millivolts, we're going to close the sodium channel. We're going to close the inactivation gate. So this huge swing from negative 70 millivolts to positive 30 millivolts is what we define as an action potential. Now this one is huge. It can be propagated or sort of passed down the membrane. It will affect the entire cell. So if we start an action potential at the axon hillock, it will still be the same strength as it gets all the way down to the end of the axon in the synapse. And so the threshold that we're talking about for an axon is negative 60 to negative 55 millivolts. So it starts here, the axon hillock and the initial segment. So look down at this part of this diagram. We're at negative 70 millivolts, and the activation gate is closed. The inactivation gate is open. Okay? And this is our sodium channel right here. When we open enough ligand-gated channels to let enough sodium in to move this to negative 60, then this activation gate springs open. And now all these other sodiums that are out here outside of this membrane are going to come through the sodium channel. And they're going to start swinging the charge from negative inside all the way up to positive 10 and eventually up to positive 30, which should be in the next slide. So let's see. Oh, no, they skipped it. Okay, we'll see it in a few seconds. So an action potential either happens or it doesn't. You either cross threshold and get all the channels to open, or you never reach threshold and it just kind of dribbles away as a local potential. So we say it has an all or none principle. Think of it like a sneeze or like a camera flash. You either get it or you don't. All action potentials will be the same size, because they always swing from negative 70 millivolts to positive 30 millivolts. Doesn't matter how strong the stimulus is, the action potential is the same size. So, to generate an action potential, first you have to use local or graded potentials to depolarize to threshold. Then that change in voltage activates voltage-gated sodium channels. Sodium rushes into the cell. The inner membrane surface changes from negative to positive, and we get a rapid depolarization. So, let's go back to this. So, obviously we're not at negative 70, so something's already happened. We've opened up ligand-gated channels, and so some sodium has come in. We've gotten to negative 60 millivolts. Now we're going to pop open the voltage gate. The activation gate opens at negative 60, and now these sodiums begin coming in. And that's where we left off. We had gotten from negative 60 to positive 10. They're still coming in. They're still coming in. And when enough of them come in to get to positive 30 millivolts, well, then we're going to shut that bottom part of this channel, the inactivation gate. So at positive 30 millivolts, inactivation gates of voltage-gated sodium channels close. Now, this is also another important number for a different gate. I'm going to go back one slide. This orange gate's just been kind of sitting here. We haven't really said much about it. This is the potassium voltage gate, and it will open up when we get to positive 30. So at positive 30 millivolts, we're going to close the inactivation gate of the sodium channel, but we're going to open the voltage-gated potassium channel. Now, remember, potassium had a problem before. Anytime it went to leave the cell, it was a positive charge, but the inside of the cell was negative, so it was drawn back in. If we are sitting at positive 10 or positive 30 millivolts, which is actually the next picture, let me go there, it leaves, and it's crowded inside, so it's leaving, and it looks back inside, and guess what? The inside of the cell is positive now. It is not drawn back in. So now the sodiums can no longer come in, but all the potassiums are going to fight to get out. This happens at the very top of the action potential at positive 30 millivolts. So no more sodiums come in, but potassiums start to leave. Now, when these positive charges start leaving, what do you think happens to this? Well, when positives leave, we start swinging the needle back down towards the resting membrane potential. This is called repolarization. So voltage-gated potassium channels will open at the top, and as we let lots of potassium out, they begin to close, but we actually let a few too many potassiums out, and we swing it down to negative 90 millivolts. So the cell becomes hyperpolarized for just a few seconds or milliseconds, and then the sodium-potassium pump will straighten it all back out, and the action potential is over. So let's look at that, the time lag. So first, we're sitting at negative 90 or negative 70. Negative 90, that's the hyperpolarization. So the potassium channel will close at negative 90. Blop. That won't let any more potassiums leave. And now we have to move back. We're hyperpolarized. We have to go from negative 90, let the sodium potassium pump run for a while, and get us back to negative 70 millivolts. So there we are. There's the resting membrane potential. Okay. So just to summarize, before we're stimulated, we're at negative 70. The first stimulation will happen. It will send a ligand, a neurotransmitter, and that will open up ligand-gated sodium channels. Sodium goes in. That will get us from negative 70 to negative 60, right? And then we will open up at negative 60, we'll open up this sodium voltage-gated channel. Sodium will come in until it reaches positive 30. When it gets to positive 30, this bottom gate will close, and this gate of the potassium channel will open. Since it's positive inside and potassium is crowded inside, it will rush out. That will start taking us from positive 30 down, 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 down. We don't close this gate until we go to negative 90. Then we close this gate, and then we get back to resting membrane potential. So there's a certain amount of time while all this is happening. Once we cross threshold, we can't do anything else to make another action potential while this one's still happening. So that's called the refractory period, from the beginning of an action potential until it returns to the resting state. So it doesn't matter how strong the stimulus is, if we're already making an action potential, since they're all the same size, we can't make another one at the same time. So there's the first part of this is called the absolute refractory period, where we've already opened up all the voltage-gated sodium channels, and so no other stimulation of the membrane can do anything else. We cannot do anything to get a second action potential. Once we close the sodium channels, however, if we had a very, very strong stimulus, we might be able to reopen those sodium channels again. So the second section is called a relative refractory period. So here's an action potential chart. So this is before we stimulate. Okay, then we start with a little bit of a ligand gated channel, so we get graded depolarization up to this dotted line, which is threshold. Right here, all the voltage gated sodium channels open, and we go from -60 to +30. Then we close the sodium channel, open the potassium channel. Potassiums leave, we begin to repolarize. We go down to -90, close the potassium channel, and then get back to resting membrane potential. So from the time we open the sodium channels until we get back down to here, we can't get another action potential. So this red is my absolute refractory period. And then once we start to get down towards threshold, a really strong stimulus could push us back up. So this blue is called the relative refractory period, and it lasts all the way until we get back to resting membrane potential. Now this explains why the signal can only move in one direction. Because if I'm on a section of membrane and it's going through this, then the area behind it is going through this. The only area that can respond is the area in front of it. I'll explain that in just a few minutes. We're going to kind of skip this. All right, that's called propagation. So propagation is how do we get this action potential that's on one part of the membrane to go down the axon? And there's two ways to do it: continuous propagation and saltatory propagation. This is where those nodes of Ranvier come in handy. So in a continuous propagation, this is an unmyelinated axon. That means every single section of the axon membrane must become depolarized and have its own action potential. So action potential starts at the initial segment, gets to +30 millivolts, we get a local current, and this will affect the next segment, like this. So we've got an action potential here, we have lots of sodium coming in, and now this +30 millivolts is going to start influencing the next section. We get first our graded depolarizations to -60, and then we start to get a new action potential here because we're going to open up voltage-gated channels here. Notice this part's still at -70. It can't go backwards because even if it were to start to try to open sodium channels, they're still open over here. So it can only go this direction. Action potential occurs in the second segment, and that action potential influences the second segment in front of it. And so we're going to continue going like this. Now, if we allow these to happen in every segment of the axon, it goes in one direction and it travels about 1 meter per second. That's continuous propagation. Okay. In section 3, so this one's still in the refractory period, so I can't get a new action potential here. This action potential is happening and it's influencing and getting ready to cause an action potential here. And as the sodium ions come in, now we start to see we've reached threshold in the third segment, and now these voltage-gated channels will open for sodium. Now, saltatory propagation is for the myelinated axons. Rather than having to cause each section of the axon membrane to have an action potential, one node of Ranvier's having an action potential can actually influence the next node. So rather than going through all the sections of the axon, the myelinated areas get to be skipped over. So it looks like the current is jumping from node to node because we only have to depolarize the membrane at the node. So if here is a node, when this one gets to +30 millivolts, rather than having to just influence this part, the myelin covering it up eliminates it. And now these changes are felt here in the next node after the internode. So this action potential will cause the next one to happen here, and this action potential will cause the next one to happen here. So we're skipping over large swaths of the axon. This is called saltatory conduction. See? Like there. And then now the action potential here is going to cause the action potential there. and it moves much, much, much faster. So here's some rules about axons. The thinner the diameter, the slower the axon can send. The larger the diameter, that lowers the resistance, the faster the axon can send the signal. So we're going to classify our axons of our neurons as type A, type B, or type C, based on their diameter and whether or not they're myelinated and how fast they can send the signal. So type A fibers are the biggest, largest diameter, mostly myelinated. So these are the fastest of all your axons. They can send information at 120 meters per second. So really important information like your position and balance or telling your skeletal muscles to work, we'll use these large type A fibers. Type B fibers are myelinated, but they're not as large a diameter, and so the speed drops from 120 meters to 18 meters per second. So not life and death kind of information going to the brain, just general sensory information and just general signals from the brain can go at this speed. Type C are unmyelinated and smallest diameter, so they are the slowest one, and they can only send the information at 1 meter per second. So things like smell and pressure and touch and things like that would just go 1 meter per second. So if it's a critical amount of information that your brain needs for a life or death situation, it's going to be sent through type A fibers. Things like pain, things like sensory information about a predator coming, or motor commands that make your body change position and prevent injury. All right, so that's the end of this particular little talk. I'll see you in the next lecture starting at slide 122.